changing your life one story at a time. This is the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast with Editor-in-Chief Amy Newmark.
Hey, it's Amy Newmark with your daily dose of Chicken Soup for the Soul inspiration. It's Wow Wednesday, and I'm going to share a story from a woman who listened to her inner voice and avoided 3 bank robberies as a result. The story is by Gail and it's called Banking on My Inner Voice. It's from our book, Chicken Soup for the Soul, Dreams and Premonitions, which I know I talk about all the time, but what can I say? There are a lot of great stories in there, so I love talking about them. So in this story, Gail starts off in Sweden. She has just checked into a hotel in Stockholm after arriving from Los Angeles. She was exhausted after such a long trip, but after she dropped off her stuff in her room and freshened up, she decided she needed to go back down to the lobby because there was a bank right next door, and she needed to change some U.S. dollars into Swedish kroner. And by the way, I looked that up today because krona is one of those, and I looked up the plural, and it's kronor. So I'm not mispronouncing it. It really is kronor. Now, despite her exhaustion and the fact that she was on a high floor of the hotel, a little voice in Gail's head told her to take the stairs down instead of the elevator. So it took her a long time to get all the way down. But when she did, she entered the hotel lobby and discovered that the place was in an uproar. The bank next door, the one she would have been in if she hadn't taken the stairs down, had just been robbed. And interestingly, this turned out to be one of the most famous bank robberies in history. This was the bank robbery that coined the term Stockholm Syndrome because the hostages started to side with the robbers during the 6 days they were locked inside with them during the negotiations. Then, years later, the same thing happened to Gail again. She was refinancing her mortgage, and she needed to take all the paperwork to the bank after she finished at the mortgage broker's office. She threw the thick packet of documents beside her on the front seat of the car, and she drove to the bank. But as she was pulling into the bank's driveway, she had this feeling of foreboding. She knew it was silly, but you know how there's this urban legend that banks are more likely to be robbed on Fridays? I guess it's because they bring in more cash on Fridays because that's the day that people withdraw cash for the weekend, and that's also the day that some people cash their paychecks if they don't have direct deposit. So it was Friday, and Gail decided not to go into the bank, and she went to a nearby store instead. And she had just walked into the store when she heard an announcement over the loudspeaker. Stay in this store until further notice. The bank down the street is surrounded with a robbery in progress. We are told that hostages have been taken. And then she heard an alarm and she heard approaching sirens. Those bank robbers took hostages too, and some of them ended up being hospitalized, and one actually suffered a major breakdown. And Gail says, that could have been me. But for that change of heart, she would have been inside that bank when it was being robbed, and she could have been taken hostage. And then it happened a third time. Gail was rushing out of Starbucks. She was trying to get to her bank a few doors away because it was nearing closing time. And she was going on another overseas trip, and she was going to the bank to order some foreign currency so she could take it with her. I guess she was getting her foreign currency ahead of time after what happened in Sweden. But just as she was leaving the Starbucks, she heard someone call her name, and it was a former colleague who she hadn't seen in years. And something told Gail to blow off the bank and sit down and talk to this woman instead. And minutes later, Gail heard an announcement. Her bank, which shared a parking lot with the Starbucks, was being robbed. She heard the alarm, and she heard the approaching sirens. She had missed another bank robbery by changing her mind at the last minute. So I've shared many stories with you about how there's nothing wrong with listening to your gut feelings, even if they cause you to sometimes do things that seem a bit silly to other people. And maybe you remember the story I told you about back in April in podcast 51, when James Gemmell saved his own life and the life of several of his coworkers when he listened to his own inner voice. Even though he was subjected to ridicule for doing so, he saved them all from being electrocuted. There's an inspirational quote that we put at the top of Gail's story about avoiding all those bank robberies. It's by Veronika Tugaleva, and it says, Our inner wisdom is persistent but quiet. It will always whisper, but it will never stop knocking at your door. And I guess the point is we should answer that door and listen to that little voice. Well, tomorrow is Thoughtful Thursday, and we'll be back to some more life lessons. We're going to meet a woman who had to revisit her teenage self to discover the grateful person that she used to be. I'm Amy Newmark. Thank you for listening to the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast today. And please remember to share it with your friends and family. If you'd like to learn more about the book I mentioned, Chicken Soup for the Soul, Dreams and Premonitions, please go to our website, chickensoup.com.